Yeah, I have on the phone right here.
I didn't have time for it today. I was taking a week in the last Oops, like I said, it's not hard. Okay, so let's get started. So I have a couple of quizzes to hand back, Jarrett. So your lab practical is this Friday. Your final exam is on Monday. And then remember that your lab notebook will also be turned in at the final exam. So you want to bring it to the final exam and turn it in first thing. And then I try to grade it while you're taking the final exam. So everybody has the final exam review sheet. Right? Everybody get a copy of that? Did you print it out? Not yet. Okay. So remember that it is in the same format as the midterm exam. So remember that you really want to make sure that you can answer those essay questions, because those are the questions that are going to be on the exam verbatim. Right? So you want to make sure that you go through and make sure that you can answer those. And by answering all of them, that actually helps you study for the multiple choice part of the test, which is kind of how I designed that. Okay, are there any questions before we start today? There are some mastering assignments that are due. The one that was due on Sunday night, I made due Tuesday at midnight. So if you did do the one this weekend, there will be one due Tuesday, and then there will be one due on Sunday as well. So if you'll notice, I forgot to mention this, but we're actually going to cover the lymphatic system, and so that is chapter 20. So it's not actually on your syllabus, your tentative syllabus, but it is on your review sheet. So just the information of the lymphatic system. Okay, so we were talking about blood pressure, and remember that one of the things about blood pressure is that it is dependent upon the cardiac output, and cardiac output is dependent upon heart rate and stroke volume. So when we look at blood pressure in the different vessels, obviously the arteries are going to be under greater pressure. And as they move through, as the blood moves through the vessels, it comes up against some resistance. And so you'll notice here that we see a dramatic drop-off in blood pressure as we go from the arteries, the aorta, the arterioles are really small. So that means that they would have more resistance. And because of that more resistance, that causes blood flow to slow down, and pressure also decreases. And then you'll notice that at capillaries, it's really low too. And that actually helps to protect the capillaries from rupturing. Because remember that the capillaries are really thin walls. They're essentially just epithelial tissue, that simple squamous epithelial tissue. And so then when the blood comes back via the veins, it is under very low pressure. And so remember we talked about there was some mechanisms that help to prevent backflow. And what was one of the main ones that we talked about? Valves. Okay, so the valves are found in the veins. And also the movement of the skeletal muscle actually helps to move the blood up. And your breathing, even your taking inhalations and exhalations and using your abdominal muscle actually helps to move the blood back towards your heart. Okay. And so one of the things that you'll notice here is that there is a pulse up here, but there's no pulse in the veins. And so what that means is that if you rupture an artery, it comes pulsing out, right? So you can always tell if you rupture an artery because it goes squirt, 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 right? If you rupture a vein, it just slowly comes out and there is no pulse in the veins. And so this pulse has to do with the relative contraction and relaxation of the ventricles. And so we talked about systolic pressure and diastolic pressure. So this refers to ventricular systole, which is where the ventricles contract, and ventricular relaxation when the ventricles relax. Okay. So what is another term for high blood pressure? Hypertension. So you could say hyper, which is above, is high blood pressure. So below is hypotension. So this is low blood pressure. And there's a variety of health concerns with hypertension, which is generally the cutoff for hypertension is 140/90. So let's say somebody is constantly 145/90 or 145/90. And when they're doing your measurements, remember it's millimeters of mercury is the unit. But I don't know if any of you have had high blood pressure, but what the doctors make you do is they make you take a card home and you have to take your blood pressure at like all these different times. So you have to collect all this data and then you bring it back and they go, oh, okay, you have hypertension, right? So they just like having high blood pressure just, at one time is not of a great concern, but it's elevated hypertension, right? So your blood pressure is elevated over time. It can start to damage the blood vessels, right? And one thing that it can cause is stroke. And do you remember what ischemic stroke means? That means where it's clogged up, the blood vessels also get clogged up and you get no oxygen to the brain. And so that's a type of stroke that can cause damage to half of the brain. Okay. Low blood pressure is not necessarily a bad thing, although if it's consistently low, sometimes it can lead to fainting. So when people get up and you have low blood pressure, then it you probably all experience this, getting up too fast. And one of the things that happens is sometimes your vision goes away, so it turns white or it gets fuzzy, right? And you feel like, oh, I gotta sit back down again. And that's because when you stood up, your blood pressure was not high enough to pump against gravity and get off the blood back up to the brain. So if you're lying down and then sit up really fast, sometimes that can be a problem, okay? So hypotension is not nearly as big of a deal in terms, it is huge if you have, it's so bad that you're passing out, but hypertension is the the silent killer, right, in society. Okay, so let's look at how blood pressure is regulated. And so in your book, they have the things that affect blood pressure, and it's in a flow chart. And so this just shows what increases. So what would cause hypertension? So this would be, and this is again in the artery. So this would be increased cardiac output, which has to do with stroke volume and heart rate. And then increase in the peripheral resistance also increases arterial pressure, okay? So one of the things that we're going to look at is the homeostasis of blood pressure. So remember that homeostasis is kind of a misnomer in that what we want to really look at is dynamic equilibrium. So how the blood pressure is regulated over the short term as well as the long term. So if you're exercising, for example, of course your heart rate is going to go up, your cardiac output is going to go up, and your arterial pressure is going to increase. But we don't want to stay elevated after you stop exercising, right? So we're going to look at the homeostasis, and we have what is referred to as a neural mechanism. So we can talk about the neural mechanism. And this is as opposed to like hormonal, which we're going to talk about in a second, or renal. And what does renal mean? What is that word? Kidney, right? So the kidneys also play a role in regulating blood flow, blood pressure. So when we look at the neural mechanism, this is the nervous system, obviously, and this tends to be fast and it tends to be short term, because that is what our nervous system is good at, fast responses, but it does not tend to be long acting compared to, say, for example, hormones. So when we look at the neural mechanism, we have receptors, and specifically we have baroreceptors. And these are located in the aorta and the carotid sinuses, or the carotid sinus, okay? So the carotid, we talked about the common carotid, internal and external carotids. Those are what deliver blood to your brain, right? And so it's really important that blood pressure is kind of tightly regulated in that particular location, because you won't want to burst your blood vessels in your brain and cause hemorrhaging, okay, which also can lead to stroke. Okay, so that's the carotid sinus. So what these measure is pressure. So they measure blood pressure, so they can detect it. And they send a signal via the afferent pathway to the part of the brain called the medulla oblongata. Okay, and this is a part of the brain that is not conscious. It's sometimes referred to as your reptilian brain, and it just receives information from the body and then will respond to it by sending out nervous signals. And so when we look at the medulla oblongata, it can do a couple of things. So this would be my control center. Okay, so let's say that we have an increase in blood pressure. This goes to the medulla, control center, and then it sends it out to the effectors. In this case, it's the heart, right? So if we have an increase in blood pressure and blood pressure is too high, we can decrease heart rate, beats per minute, okay? And you now know that that is parasympathetic, right? So we talked about that when we were talking about the diving reflex. So the parasympathetic division of the nervous system decreases heart rate, okay? It also sends it out to the arteries. So these are what are called the effectors, if you remember our discussion of homeostasis. And so these cause vasodilation. Okay, so actually there is fewer nervous impulses sent to the smooth muscle of the artery, and that actually causes them to dilate because it's only innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. Anyway, so that causes vasodilation, and what this leads to is a decrease in blood pressure. Right? So that's the negative feedback. This is the response, right? And it has a negative effect on the stimulus, so it decreases the stimulus. And so it helps to maintain a relatively steady homeostatic equilibrium, that your body can increase blood pressure when it needs to, but it maintains it at a relatively constant rate otherwise. Okay. So in your book, there's a diagram of this that you should study. Okay, and so this is what it looks like from your book. So this is the one that we just talked about. Okay. And then if it decreases, if your blood pressure is too low, so let's say you're laying down and your blood pressure, you need to increase your blood pressure, right? The opposite happens. So the blood pressure low falls, and then these are little receptors that are inside your body that can detect blood pressure, right? And so they are not being stretched, for example, as much as normal, because they're little stretch receptors in the blood vessels. And so this causes vasoconstriction and increases the heart rate, and then this increases the amount of blood returning to the heart, and then that increases the blood pressure. Okay. So this is the neural mechanism of regulating blood flow. Okay. So we also have hormonal regulation. Okay. So the heart itself produces a hormone that is abbreviated as ANP. So this is called the atrial natriuretic peptide. Atrial, so I can spell it right. Oh, natriuretic, sorry. Okay. And this is produced if there is too much blood coming back to the heart. And so this is actually a hormone that is produced by the heart, and it is a vasodilator, natriuretic. That's an R. So it's Natriuitic. So it's produced by heart, and it causes vasodilation. So this decreases blood pressure, and this protects the heart from extreme pressures, right? So the function is it protects the heart. Okay. So if there's too much blood and it's under too high a pressure coming into the atria, this gets produced, right? And it causes blood, it releases it into the circulatory system because this is hormones, right? So it's kind of a long term, and then it decreases blood pressure throughout the body. So not so much blood and not high enough rate is coming back to the heart. Okay, so that's one. We also have the ones that are involved in the sympathetic nervous system. So we have norepinephrine and epinephrine. And these are sometimes referred to as adrenaline. And what organ produces these? What organ produces epinephrine and norepinephrine? Nope. So it's called adrenaline. Why is it called adrenaline? Adrenal glands, right? So this is produced by the adrenal glands, right? And so people talk about adrenal fatigue, where they are constantly on like fight or flight response. They're so stressed out, and there's constantly, and it's one of the things that affects their body is that they are constantly producing these stress hormones, and these lead to hypertension because these cause vasoconstriction. And these increase blood pressure. Okay. They also cause an increase in heart rate, so I'll put that. So these increase heart rate. And we'll actually talk about in a little bit what happens when you go into shock, specifically shock that is caused by a drop in blood pressure, vascular shock, and how you can use epinephrine to constrict the blood vessels and boost the blood pressure. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so these are kind of strictly hormonal, but now I want to talk about the role of the kidney, because the kidney functions to filter the blood of nitrogenous wastes like urea. It also helps to regulate blood pressure and blood volume. So if we look at the renal, this means kidney. Okay. And so the kidney's function is to remove waste products from the blood. And so I'll put in the parentheses here, urea. Okay, so that's the urea, that's the yellow, the urine, urochrome. That's what makes the urine smell, right? Okay, so that's urea. And then it also helps to regulate solute concentration. So regulate blood solute concentrations. Okay. So when we look at solutes in the blood, sugar is one of those, right? Sodium and chloride are other examples of solutes. And if they get too high, then you tend to get thirsty. And so like if you have diabetes and you have high sugar levels in your blood, one of the things that's going to affect is you're going to get really, really thirsty. And you're also going to tend to get, you're going to produce a lot of urine, but you're going to get rid of a lot of sugar in the urine as well, right? So this is just a function of the kidney. And we're going to talk more about the kidney in 233, but that's kind of important because it also regulates blood pressure. And this has to do with the fact that in the kidney, we have capillaries. We have specialized capillaries that function to filter substances out of the blood while keeping the blood cells in the vessels. And if the blood pressure is too high, so let's say if we have too high blood pressure coming into the kidneys, then it can damage the capillaries. Right? So you can actually get blood in your urine, and you could actually get kidney failure over time. If you like blow out all the blood vessels in your kidneys and all the capillaries in your kidneys, then you're going to need a new kidney, right? So it can cause kidney failure. Okay. If it is too low, not enough filtration occurs. And so what happens is that the nitrogenous waste in the blood and other waste products tend to accumulate, and it makes you feel really, really bad. And it can actually eventually cause you to go into a coma and die, right? So this is why blood pressure is so important to the kidney, and so why the kidney has a mechanism for regulating it, okay? So let's look at the mechanism. There's actually a bunch of them, so we'll go through them one at a time, and they're actually also interrelated, so it's kind of a little confusing. Okay, so when we look at the mechanism, the first one is that if blood pressure is high, okay, so if there's an increase in blood pressure, then renin is released by the kidney. So renin is released into the circulatory system by the kidney. Renin is actually an enzyme, and it causes a chemical reaction to occur. And so it causes angiotensinogen, which is the inactive form. We've seen this inogen before. Does anybody remember what other word did we talk about this quarter that had inogen in the end of it? Had to do with blood clotting. Yes, fibrinogen. So remember that when we have inogens in our blood, those are the inactive forms. So fibrinogen is converted to fibrin in the presence of thrombin, right, which is a blood clotting factor that gets converted after all that enzymatic cascade. Okay, so angiotensinogen is converted to angiotensin 1. Actually 2, sorry, angiotensin 2. Okay, I'm not sure why it's 2, but it is. Okay, so biochemistry, they gave that 2. Okay, so this is inactive, this is active. And if you think about what this word means, angio means like heart, blood vessels, right? Tension means a constriction, right? So this causes an increase in blood pressure by causing vasoconstriction, right? So just think of that word and think, oh, that must cause vasoconstriction because we're talking about an increase in the tension. So that increases blood vessels. Okay. So this is the first one. So I'll put number one. Okay. So number 2. The presence of angiotensinogen causes another hormone to be released, and this is actually a hormone that's produced by the adrenal glands called aldosterone. So I'll put aldosterone is released, from adrenal glands. It's actually a different part of the adrenal gland than the norepinephrine and the epinephrine, right? And it goes into circulation, right? And so it goes into the body and it goes to the kidneys. So its target organ is the kidneys. So it targets the kidneys. And it causes an increase in sodium reabsorption. So it increases sodium ion reabsorption. And when we reabsorb sodium, what comes with that, just kind of passively, is water. So this causes an increase in water reabsorption. So this increases blood volume, which increases blood pressure. So this is reabsorption from our urine that we're producing. So we can get rid of excess salts, we can reabsorb it, we can get rid of excess water, or we can reabsorb it. And reabsorption means that we take it from the filtrate and we return it to the blood, okay? So aldosterone is a hormone that helps to regulate blood pressure. Okay, the last one, which I need to do a little topic here, whiteboard. Okay, so the last one, so this is my third one, is antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so what does diuresis mean? Does anybody know? Yes, and so that would be like urine output, right? So you're getting rid of excess water. So antidiuretic means that you're retaining water. So this is the retention of water. Okay, by the kidney. So if your blood pressure is too low, then you retain water, and this increases blood volume. And this increases blood pressure. So if I don't drink enough water, then I get really thirsty and I just think I need to drink. But if I can't drink the water, even though I'm thirsty, then my body produces antidiuretic hormone. And I forgot to mention where this was produced. This is produced by the posterior pituitary. And so that's up near the brain. That's where that actually sits in the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone in your brain case, right? Okay, so that's the posterior pituitary gland. So it travels via the circulatory system to the kidneys. It binds to those tubules in the kidneys, and it causes water to be reabsorbed, and it increases blood pressure. Okay. If I drink a lot of water, then my body stops producing antidiuretic hormone, and I can get rid of the excess water, right, by urinating it out. So this would mean that you would produce little concentrated urine. Okay. If ADH is not present, right, I can produce lots of dilute urine. And if you cannot regulate your ADH levels, then you actually have a type of, they call it diabetes, but it has nothing to do with glucose. So it's a type of diabetes called diabetes insipidus. Insipidus, okay? It's not related to diabetes mellitus. Okay, so insipidus means that you're losing urine. So one of the characteristics of being diabetic is you're thirsty all the time and you're urinating all the time, and you might actually at some point start to lose weight because your body can't use the nutrients that you're reabsorbing, right? And so the reason why when you produce lots of dilute urine, that's just another type of diabetes, which is related to ADH, not to glucose. Okay, so in your book, there's a nice flow sheet that shows renal regulation and how all these are related to one another.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Diabetes insipidus, that's too low ADH or too much ADH?
If your that would be too, you wouldn't be producing enough ADH, right? Because you'd be producing a lot of urine. Yep. Okay. So here, if our arterial pressure is too low, okay, the kidney produces renin, which causes angiotensinogen to be produced, which then subsequently also causes ADH release and causes aldosterone secretion, which then affect blood volume, which then ultimately will increase the arterial pressure in the blood vessels. So this shows sodium reabsorption by kidneys, water reabsorption by kidneys, increasing blood volume. Okay. And then also angiotensinogen causing vasoconstriction, which causes a decrease in blood vessels. So sometimes they call this the renin, angiotensinogen, aldosterone mechanism, right, of blood pressure regulation. And one of your essay questions has to do with talking about that relationship between renin and blood pressure. Okay, any questions about that? No? Okay. Okay, so let's talk about circulatory shock. So this is where blood pressure drops dramatically and can cause people to pass out and go into a coma. And so two that I want to talk about are hypovolemic shock. So think, oops, forgot my O there, hypovolemic. So just think about this word, low volume, right? So this is due to loss of blood. And this can be due to external hemorrhaging, but it also could be due to internal hemorrhaging, right? So loss of blood. Oh, loss of blood, sorry. Loss of blood. Okay. Okay, we could also talk about vascular shock. And what this means is that for some reason, the blood vessels lose pressure dramatically. And one example of vascular shock, which can be relatively common because of allergies, is called, what is it? Anaphylactic shock. So this is an example of vascular shock. It's anaphylactic shock. And this is due to a rapid decrease in blood pressure. Okay.
So how does that work? Because is it like when you're being if you're going into anaphylactic shock, wouldn't you be like really stressed? And doesn't that like cause high blood pressure? Yes,
but what the immune system is really powerful here. Okay. So anaphylactic shock is what happens when people like are super allergic to bee sting or peanuts, or it can be due to an allergy, right? And so it makes them super sick, right? And so this is due to the rapid release of histamine. So if you remember, as a little review, what was the white blood cell that we talked about that specializes in releasing histamine? So it's never let monkeys eat bananas. So which one is the last one? Basophils, right? Okay, so this could be due to, yes, this is anaphylactic shock, yeah. Could be due to allergens, right? So what happens is that histamine causes the capillaries to become leaky and fluid leaves the blood vessels and enters the tissues. So it causes swelling in your body, but there is low blood pressure because all that fluid that is now in your tissues was creating blood pressure in your body. So the fluid leaves the blood vessels and goes into the tissues. So just put fluids, tissues. And this causes edema, for example, swelling. And this can be really a problem if it blocks your pharynx, right? Because that would inhibit your ability to breathe, right? So the back of, they always say the back of your throat is the scariest part, right? Because if it clamps up, then you can't breathe, and you die. Okay. So this is sometimes treated with what is referred to as an EpiPen. Okay. And EpiPens were in the news recently because the person who, bought the corporation that made them increased their cost by like 500% or something, and got a lot of trouble, right? So people just started making their own EpiPens. Even now they're kind of expensive. Like if you had a child, they recommend that you always have an EpiPen on hand, right? But last time we bought one, it was like $150, right? And it's probably something that's just going to sit in your medicine cabinet and you're never going to use, but you have to have it because it's like, what if you didn't have it? Huh?
They expire.
They expire? I know. So mine's probably expired. Okay, so EpiPen is epinephrine. So it is just a shot of epinephrine that you usually put into the thigh of the individual, like if it's a baby and they go into anaphylactic shock, right? And so what does epinephrine do? We just learned vasoconstrictor. So it causes a decrease in the diameter and it boosts blood pressure. So it vasoconstricts. Okay. EpiPen. The other thing that they always say you should have in your medicine cabinet is Benadryl. Right? That's because that will, as an antihistamine, which will also stop the swelling, any dangerous swelling that you might have. Okay. Okay, so in your book, they have a diagram that shows hugely what happens when you start to lose blood. So this would be like hypovolemic shock. So you're losing blood, right? So this would essentially help to boost and maintain blood pressure. So ADH is released, right? Renin is released. So ultimately, all those things that happen to you in order to help to retain water happens. You can have a depression when you lose hypovolemic shock. You can go into a coma, or you can become really restless. I guess that's the early sign of it. Okay. Skin becomes cold because there's not blood being shunted to the skin to keep it warm, and cyanotic means that it becomes blue, right? So there's lots of deoxygenated blood being retained in the vessels. And then your heart gets fast because you're trying to increase blood pressure by increasing heart rate. And then you increase the depth of your breathing so that you can get rid of extra CO2 that your body is retaining because of this low blood pressure. Anyway, so this is kind of what happens to you if you had a major wound and started bleeding out. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is, just briefly, is what is called tissue perfusion. Okay, and this is the idea that we need to be able to get oxygen and nutrients to tissues when it is needed. Okay, so this is the blood vessels deliver O2 and nutrients to cells in the tissues. They also pick up CO2 and waste products. Okay. So if tissues are not being perfused properly, especially the brain, for example, you have a big problem in that you'll pass out and go into a coma. But we also want the blood vessels to go to the digestive tract to pick up nutrients, like during the parasympathetic nervous system when you're relaxed. But then we need the blood to move away from the digestive system and goes to the muscles when we need to exercise, okay? So we can talk about the mechanisms that shunt blood to different areas of the body. So mechanisms for shunting blood where it is most needed. And we can look at where blood is going when you're relaxed, when the parasympathetic nervous system is taking over, versus when sympathetic nervous system is kind of playing a larger role. So in your book, you have a diagram that shows where the blood is when you're at rest versus when you are exercising. So you'll notice that blood goes when you are at rest, right? It stays pretty evenly distributed in the body. Notice a lot of blood goes to the kidneys, and that's the amazing thing about the kidneys. They actually use a lot of your energy to filter the blood, and a lot of your blood goes, that's like what, 1/5 of the blood flow goes to the kidneys. And then you'll notice that kidney flow when you're exercising actually goes down. Your body's not shunting the blood there but it goes dramatically up from 1,200 to 12,500. That's like, what, 100 times the amount of blood flow to the skeletal muscles, okay? So we have mechanisms that allow for this, and one mechanism is just the regulating blood vessel diameter, right? And so we can talk about vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So when you're exercising, the blood vessels that carry blood to the skeletal muscles are under vasodilation. So I'll say vasodilation increases blood flow to the part of the body that needs it. And we could just have vasodilation in response to oxygen levels. So the blood vessels actually respond to low oxygen levels, low O2 levels. And so if those blood vessels sense that the muscles are using up all of the oxygen, then it causes those blood vessels to dilate, right? So the blood vessels can actually respond to the concentration of oxygen in the tissues, okay? If you're not using your muscles, then vasoconstriction happens and blood is shunted to a different part of the body, okay? So there are some other things that affect shunting of the blood. And one of these is kind of interesting just because it's in a drug that is kind of under attack or discussion lately, which is nitric oxide. So another example is NO. This is nitric oxide gas. So when this is produced by tissues, it causes vasodilation. So the tissue produces the nitric oxide gas, and then it causes the blood vessels to dilate, and so it shunts blood to them. And so does anybody know what drug is used to help shunt blood to the erectile tissue in a male's penis to cause erection? What is the drug that you take? If you have a hard, Viagra, right? So Viagra, for example, increases NO production, and this shunts blood to the erectile tissue in the penis. I ran out of the room.
Did you say this is a dilator?
Yes, so it's a vasodilator. Yep. Okay. This is not only where it occurs, nitric oxide, occurs other places in the body, but this is just a major mechanism for maintaining erection. So the reason why Viagra is in the news is because they're saying, if you're not going to pay for birth control, perhaps you shouldn't pay for men's Viagra, right? So insurance companies pay for this, right? So it's kind of good news. Okay, Okay, so if we look at some other examples of this in your book, they talk about all the things that cause vasodilation, right? So I just mentioned 2 of these. So decrease O2, okay? Well, if oxygen levels are decreased, then we're also going to have an increase in CO2 because your muscles are producing carbon dioxide as a waste product. With CO2, you also get an increase in hydrogen ion concentration, so it becomes more acidic, right? And then I mentioned nitric oxide is an example of as a dilator, okay? So that's just actually intrinsic. So the muscles will just respond to these things that are in their blood vessels, right? Then we also have neural and hormonal. So ANP, that is a powerful dilator produced by the heart. We talked about that. And then we also talked about neural. If you increase sympathetic, or excuse me, if you decrease sympathetic tone, you get dilation. If you increase sympathetic tone, then you get constriction. And then all of these other things, you would say that these are important vasoconstrictors. Blood vessels will respond to stretch by constricting. So we talked about those major arteries that are close to the heart, and when they stretch, in response to stretching, they will contract, right? And that actually just keeps the blood flowing in a very smooth manner through the blood vessels. Okay. So blood tends to flow under the path of least resistance. Okay, so I have a handout. We're going to move to the lymphatic system. And I mistakenly had 2 pages, and so the second page is blank, so I'm just going to hand them out because I didn't feel like ripping off the staple, so you can use your blank page for whatever you want to use it for. Okay, so remember that one of the main functions of the lymphatic system is to pick up fluid that is lost from the circulatory system. So lymphatic vessels tend to be found around capillaries because they pick up excess fluid lost from capillaries. So I'm going to write down some other things that the lymphatic system does as well. So 1, it picks up fluid lost from capillaries. Now remember, not all of the fluid that leaves the capillaries stays out, but remember that the capillaries suck fluid back in due to high osmotic concentration inside. So fluid will tend to be sucked back in, but sometimes not all of the fluid gets sucked back in, and so it has to be picked up by the lymphatic vessels. Okay. Okay. This fluid is called lymph. Now, interestingly, we don't usually think about this, but the lymphatic system is really important because when it gets clogged up, it can lead to swelling, tissue swelling. And so I mentioned the example of the elephantiasis, right? Really bad, right? Damage to the lymphatic vessels. And so, but the other function of the lymph is to filter microorganisms. So it filters out microbes and debris. So debris could be damaged cells. It could be broken up cells, right? So we'll talk about what that debris is, okay? And then this is an immune function. So I'll put immune function here. The other function of the lymphatic system is that it picks up lipids that are absorbed from the small intestine. So it picks up lipids. absorbed. So lipids are fats, right? Same thing. Absorbed from the small intestine. And this is a really good thing, right? Because if you think about, we sometimes take in a lot of fat all at once, right? So if you eat a really fatty meal, you don't want all of that fat being dumped into your circulatory system where it could cause a problem. So what happens is it gets picked up by the lymphatic system, and then it gets delivered back up through the body and then put back into the circulatory system up near the neck, okay? So this is the main function of the lymphatic system: immune, picking up excess fluid, and transporting lipids in the body. We're going to talk about some specialized organs maybe today or tomorrow. Okay, so let's look at the lymphatic system. So usually the lymphatic system is in green. So here I think I've already showed you this diagram, which shows the lymphatic vessels that are surrounding. The thing about the lymphatic system is that it doesn't have any pumps, and the tissue itself consists of blind-ended vessels. So the blind-ended vessels have little flaps on them that allow them to open up if the pressure in the tissue increases. So let's say that you get an increase in pressure in fluid. What that does is that opens up that flap, and then the fluid will just kind of move in. And the thing about the lymphatic system is this doesn't have a pump, a central pump like our heart, right? So there's no pumping. So it has to have valves in it, and it's simply just moved by pressure. And so sometimes they talk about lymphatic massage, right? And you're like, oh, what's the difference between that and another type of massage? But sometimes the people that do lymphatic massage specialize in trying to get the lymph to move up and out so that you reduce tissue swelling, right? So you can have a lymphatic massage to try to move the lymph, which is a little bit different than a deep muscle tissue massage, for example. Okay. So they're blind-ended tubes with these little flaps that open up if there's pressure in the interstitial fluid. Okay, so let's look at the diagram that I gave you. And one of the things that you might not be able to see very well in this diagram is the difference in color. So I'm just going to draw, you want to draw that line down the center of the body, right? And then it goes like that. So the right side and the left side of the lymphatic system are different. Kind of a little bit like the right side and the left side of the circulatory system are just a little bit different. And so you'll notice here that your right arm, and I'm not sure why this is the case, but your right arm goes to the vessel that is a lymphatic vessel that is going to drain it into these major blood vessels right here. And so right here, this is the jugular vein. So I could write my jugular vein. And what do you think this is? It's underneath the clavicle, so it is the subclavian vein. Okay. So the left side is the side of the body that carries all of the lymph that includes the lymph that is taken from the digestive tract. So here, this would be like showing where it's going to the small intestine, and here's going to the stomach, right? And actually all the lymph from your legs also comes up the right side of the body rather than the left side of the body, okay? So if we look at these nodes, in your neck region when you get sick, you get swelling of this nodal tissue, and these are what are referred to as cervical nodes. So the accumulation of nodal tissue in your armpits, what do you think? What is the armpit region? I wouldn't put armpit, I would put what? Axillary nodes. Okay. And then there's a group down here. So if you get really, really sick, sometimes those swell up. And this region is called the groin or what? Inguinal nodes. Okay, so we'll talk about those, what that nodal tissue is, but I just want to point out that one of the things that is interesting about our lymphatic system is that here you see superficial lymphatic vessels like underneath the skin, but they, and in your textbook it probably says that the lymphatic system does not go to the brain, right? So there's no, they say there's no lymphatic system. So everybody's been learning the lymphatic system does not go to the brain. So recently, they discovered that they were totally wrong, right? So they actually found these new vessels, right? And so there's going to be a revision. Most of the revisions to your book are kind of meaningless, right? They're just like little tiny little changes here and there. But this one is kind of a big one, okay? So they found that hidden kind of in the meninges of the brain, the outer coverings of the brain, were lymphatic vessels, and they thought they were just capillaries, and they just didn't see them. So this is kind of the old picture of the lymphatic system, and then this is the new one. Okay. And so they actually think the lymphatic system might be really important in the brain, and so they're looking at it in terms of some brain diseases like Alzheimer's. Maybe there's a role that the lymphatic system plays, the immune system plays in the development of neurological disorders like Alzheimer's. So there is a lymphatic system in your brain. Okay. Okay, so let's look at the cells and the tissues. So we can talk about, in the lymphatic system, we can talk about macrophages. And macrophages are leukocytes, and they're large phagocytes. And there's little stations where these macrophages reside, and these are what are called the nodes. So in the lymph nodes, these are composed of reticular connective tissue. So reticular means that they have lots of little spaces due to the presence of fibers, right? So it's like a net. Right? So each node has a net of connective tissue, and this is where the macrophages reside. And if they sense an infection, then they start to proliferate. So they start to undergo cell division. They start to divide and reproduce. And that is one of the things that causes the swelling. The other thing that causes the swelling is just kind of the aftermath of macrophages, and fighting off microbes can sometimes lead to pus, which also can accumulate in your lymph nodes, okay? So if we look at this diagram of the tissue, right? So this shows the reticular fibers in the connective tissue, and then here's your large macrophages. And then these are also lymphocytes, and so we'll talk about the lymphocytes, specifically T lymphocytes, in a minute. But lymphocytes are also white blood cells that aid in fighting off infection. So them going through the nodes, it's just when they go through a node, that's where it's guarded, right? So that's where all these white bloods reside in order to fight off infection. So we have also lymphoid organs, right? And organs means that they're composed of more than one type of tissue. And so we have large nodal tissues like the tonsils. So we have the palatine tonsils. Okay. So palatine is the bone, or the palatine bone that makes up your hard roof of your mouth, right? And so this would be paired. They have two of these, two. So I'll put paired. So when you look down your throat and you say, ah, this is what they're looking for. They're looking for your palatine tonsils, okay? We also, however, have a linguinal tonsil. So where do you think that is? What does linguinal mean? Tongue, right? The back of the tongue. So if you've ever had the back of your tongue swell up and get sore, that's because that is a tonsil as well. And then we have the pharyngeal tonsil. So that has another name. Does anybody know what that is? Adenoids, right? Your adenoids. Okay, that's your pharyngeal tonsil. So on the back of your piece of paper, there's shows the location of these tonsils. Okay, so this is referring to the pharyngeal. These would be the palatine. There's two of those, right, on either side of the throat. And then the one right here is the linguinal, the back of the tongue. Okay, so if we look at, go down, we look at the other diagrams. Separate page for me, okay? So this right here would be the pharyngeal, so that's where way up would be where your adenoids are. This one right here would be the palatine. And this one right here would be the lingual. When your tonsils are removed, they don't necessarily take your adenoids. You know, I don't know if they would just do the adenoids and not the tonsils. I'm not sure. That's a good question. Right. One of the things that's really interesting about these nodal tissues, and specifically the tonsils, is that they have crypts in them. So these contain crypts. And so these are actually specially designed to capture debris, right? So they're designed to capture microorganisms. So hopefully your body will detect an invasion of a bacteria or a virus before it gets to your lower respiratory tract, your lungs. So this is kind of like the gateway. These are the gatekeepers, right? But unfortunately, what that means is that sometimes they are constantly swollen, specifically in children. So when children are just starting to learn and their immune systems are starting to just develop, they catch a lot of different types of microorganisms, and their tonsils will swell up. And sometimes they swell up so much, though, that it's really hard for them to swallow, right? And so if it becomes a problem with swallowing and breathing, then sometimes they will still take them out. It used to be that they would just take them out on a regular basis, right? Because they didn't really understand the importance. So these, I would say, protects against lower respiratory infections. So if you have your tonsils out, you might have an increased risk of getting things like pneumonia, right? So you have an increased risk of that. So the other things that sometimes they happen with these is that sometimes you can get what are called tonsil lifts. I don't know how to spell that. Tonsil lifts. Tonsil lifts. There, tonsil lifts. So these are tonsil stones, right? Because those crypts can be very deep, they can actually capture food particles, and then they, because of the way that the macrophages work, they kind of turn them into hard calcium deposits, right? And so the tonsil stones can become problematic because they can make your tonsils big and they can make them bleed. And then people can, supposedly people can go in there and they can pop the stones out, right? And so it just can be a really miserable thing if you imagine if your tonsils were constantly filled with tonsil stones. And so this is kind of like a low-grade infection that becomes a problem. And so oftentimes if tonsil lifts are a big problem, then they remove the tonsils. So it has to do with how big your crypts are. Well, if you look at the tonsil crypts, so here's like the crypts in the tonsil, right? So let's say you get a big stone right back there, and if your tonsils are big, you could actually take your finger back there and poke on it, and it would just pop out. And I wished I had pictures of them because they, you know, they can get pretty big. Yeah.
They have like little tools too, stuff like that, I guess, like little like probes.
Dental tools maybe that help to pop them out. Yeah. Has anybody in here had tonsil stones? Yeah. Did you get your tonsils removed? No. Did they just go away on their own? Yeah. Did you have like?
I was like really sick.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we're going to stop there for today, and then we'll finish with the lymphatic system on Wednesday and bring any questions you have. Any questions you might have about the review sheets. Are you gonna take the quiz now?
Yeah, wait, so